when you picture Yosemite National Park, what do you see? You probably picture El Capitan piercing the sky or the mist coming off Yosemite Falls.
Right, those giant sequoias.
Yeah, exactly. It's this pristine, majestic sanctuary. And we look at a place like that and we expect the danger to be, well, natural.
Like a sheer drop or a sudden
Well,
storm.
maybe to black bear, right.
Mm.
We don't expect the danger to wear a staff uniform and hold a set of motel keys.
No, you really don't.
But in 1999, Carrie Stainer completely shattered that illusion of sanctuary. To really understand the how, we have to set the scene. Take us back to February 1999.
So we are at the Cedar Lodge in El Portal, California. It sits right outside the entrance to Yosemite.
Right.
Carol Sund, who's 42, her 15-year-old daughter, Julie, and a 16-year-old family friend from Argentina named Silvina Palazzo, they check into the motel.
It's just a classic sightseeing trip.
Exactly. And they are placed in room 509.
And working at that lodge is a 37-year-old maintenance man named Carrie Stainer. He actually, he lives in an apartment right above the lodge's restaurant.
Yeah, he's right there on the property.
And he sees these 3 women check in. And according to the FBI files, he doesn't just casually notice them, he specifically targets them because they don't have a male companion.
He literally referred to them as easy prey.
Ugh, that's chilling. But I'm stuck on how he actually gets into the room. Because, you know, women traveling alone are usually incredibly cautious about opening their door at night to a stranger.
Well, that brings us to one of the most terrifying details in the Supreme Court brief. Stainer used what he called a ruse.
A ruse.
Yeah, but it was actually a highly sophisticated psychological conditioning tactic.
Oh, wow. How did that work?
So on the night of February 15th, he puts together a kit in his backpack. He packs duct tape, a knife, a rope, a gun, and white gardening gloves.
To avoid leaving fingerprints, I assume?
Exactly. He puts on a dark hoodie, and he walks down the exterior corridor toward their room. But he doesn't go straight to their door.
What does he do?
He stops at the empty rooms nearby, and he bangs loudly on the doors and yells, "Maintenance!"
Wait, real?
Yeah. He lets himself in, slams the door, and then moves to the next one, doing the exact same thing.
He's intentionally trying to desensitize them to the sound of his arrival.
He is. He knows a sudden knock at night triggers an alarm response.
Yeah.
But if you hear a maintenance worker moving loudly down the hall, just doing his job.
Your brain just categorizes it as normal, non-threatening activity.
Right. So by the time he knocks on room 509 and claims there is a water leak he needs to check, Carol Sund's guard is down.
And she opens the door.
She does.
It's psychological manipulation before he even makes eye contact. And once he is inside, the violence is just overwhelming.
It is. He immediately pulls the gun and forces compliance. He binds all 3 of them with that duct tape he brought. Then he strangles Carol on the bed. He takes Silvina into the bathroom and strangles her. And he actually keeps Julie alive through the night.
Which is just horrific to even imagine.
The next morning, he forces Julie into their rental car, drives her to a remote reservoir at Lake Don Pedro, sexually assaults her, and slits her throat.
The brutality is horrifying enough, but the countermeasures he takes afterwards. I mean, this is a guy whose only prior criminal record was a minor marijuana charge.
Right. Nothing violent.
So where does a motel handyman learn to cover his tracks like a forensic expert? Because he didn't just flee the scene.
No. He wiped down their rental car. It was a red Pontiac Grand Prix to remove all of his fingerprints.
And his efforts to control the FBI investigation go way beyond just wiping down a steering wheel.
Oh, absolutely. He actively planted false evidence to send law enforcement chasing ghosts.
Like what?
Well, he took Carol Sund's wallet and drove it miles away to Modesto. He tossed it in the street specifically to shift the geographic focus of the search.
Wow, so he's trying to make him look in a completely different city.
Yeah, and then he carved the words, "We have Sarah," into the hood of the rental car before burning it in the woods.
We have Sarah, meaning he's trying to imply that Julie is still alive, her name is Sarah, and there is a group of kidnappers, not just one guy.
Right. He's layering all these false narratives. Later, he even hand draws a map to help the FBI find Julie's body.
A map? Are you kidding me?
He signs it with fake names, draws a heart on it, and writes, "We had fun with this one."
That is just pure evil.
He was taunting them. He felt entirely secure that he had outsmarted federal investigators.
He was so secure that when the FBI set up their command post and were at the Cedar Lodge investigating, Stainer actually helped them.
He was right in the middle of it.
Yeah, he helped agents collect blanket samples from the motel rooms for evidence. I mean, it's like a real-life horror movie where the monster is the guy holding the flashlight for the investigators.
What's fascinating here is how his countermeasures reveal a highly organized offender.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, in behavioral analysis, serial offenders usually fall into two categories: disorganized and organized.
Right.
A disorganized killer acts out of a sudden frenzy or severe psychosis. They leave weapons behind, they leave fingerprints. The scene is just chaotic.
But Stainer wasn't like that at all.
It's not at all. Stainer's behavior is the textbook definition of organized. He brought a pre-assembled kit. He used a ruse to gain peaceful entry.
He wore the gloves.
Exactly.
Oh.
He disconnected the phone in the room so they couldn't call the front desk. He altered the physical evidence.
He wasn't relying on past criminal experience. He was relying on meticulous preparation and just this obsessive need for control.
But all that obsessive control completely unravels a few months later.
Yeah, because by July 1999, the FBI is distracted. They are publicly focusing on two half-brothers with extensive criminal histories who lived in Modesto.
Right near where Carol's wallet was found.
Exactly. So Stainer's misdirection actually worked.
It worked almost too well. Stainer felt completely invincible. He had literally gotten away with a triple homicide in a national park.
So on July 21st, he strikes again.
He spots 26-year-old Yosemite naturalist Joey Armstrong outside her cabin.
But the circumstances are totally different this time. It's broad daylight, and Joey fights back vigorously.
She fought for her life. He managed to force her into his truck, but as he was driving away, she fought him off and jumped out of the open back window of the moving vehicle.
While it was moving, that's incredible.
She ran for the woods. Stainer had to stop the truck, chase her down near a creek, and that is where he murdered her, ultimately decapitating her.
And because this attack wasn't perfectly controlled in a motel room, because it was chaotic and out in the open, he makes a crucial slip-up.
A huge mistake.
An eyewitness spots his vehicle parked near the scene. And it's not just some generic sedan. It's a 1972 International Scout.
Painted pale blue with white stripes.
Yeah, it's a highly distinct, memorable vehicle.
And that vehicle description breaks the case wide open. Law enforcement traces the Scout to Cary Stainer.
They track him down just 3 days later, and they find him hiding out at a nudist colony, of all places.
Which is just bizarre in itself.
Here's where it gets really interesting. They arrest him, and they put him in a car to drive him to the FBI office in Sacramento. He's in the car with Agent Jeff Renick.
And surprisingly, Stainer doesn't ask for a lawyer.
No, he actually bonds with Agent Renick. He decides he's going to confess to everything. But before he gives up the details, this guy who meticulously wiped down a trunk to avoid fingerprints sits there eating pizza and tries to negotiate a deal for his confession.
The demands he makes really highlight a bizarre disconnect in his psyche.
I mean, what does he ask for?
On one hand, you have a calculating, lethal predator. On the other, you have a man with the social and moral judgment of a child.
Right.
He tells the FBI he will confess if they give him a massive collection of child pornography. He also wants preferred housing in a specific prison, and he wants the reward money that had been offered for his own capture.
It's absurd. It's completely delusional to think the federal government is going to give you reward money for turning yourself in for murder.
Totally delusional.
But he does eventually detail everything. And during that confession, he drops a bombshell about his motive. He originally claimed he took Joey Armstrong to sexually assault her.
But he admits to Agent Renick that was just an excuse.
Right. He says he simply wanted to kill her.
This is where the A&E article brings in some crucial insights from Dr. Fred Berlin. He's a renowned expert on sexual offenders.
What did she say about it?
Dr. Berlin explains that Stainer's motivation was deeply tied to a specific type of paraphilia, or, abnormal sexual desire.
Because most people assume a serial killer who doesn't explicitly act out of sexual assault must be a sadist.
Right, but a classic sadist is sexually aroused by inflicting pain, suffering, and fear. Dr. Berlin points out that Stainer wasn't primarily driven by the pain of his victims.
Then what was the drive? If it's not the suffering, what is he getting out of it?
Control. Absolute unyielding control. His paraphilia was rooted in the enjoyment of successfully dominating his victims by force.
Wow.
It wasn't about watching them suffer. It was about the godlike power of deciding whether another human being lived or died and forcing their total compliance.
So the duct tape, the gun, the ruse, they were all tools to establish absolute dominion over another person. Which perfectly sets up the second half of our deep dive. Because with that detailed confession locked down, the trial isn't about whether Cary Stainer committed the Yosemite murders.
No, that was proven.
The trial becomes a massive psychiatric battle over why he did it. He pleads not guilty by reason of insanity. And you, listening to this, you really have to hear his family history.
Because it is an almost unbelievably tragic story.
It forces a jury to weigh horrific trauma against premeditated evil.
To understand the defense's argument for insanity, you really have to go back to 1972. Cary Stayner is 11 years old.
Okay.
He's a 7-year-old younger brother named Stephen. One day, Stephen is kidnapped off the street by a child molester.
And Stephen is held captive for 7 long years.
Yes. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because Stephen eventually heroically escaped, and his story became the subject of a massive media frenzy.
Right, the famous television miniseries, I Know My First Name is Stephen.
Exactly.
It's a tragedy that consumes the entire family. While Stephen was missing, the Stayner household essentially collapsed.
The parents, particularly his father, were so consumed by grief and the desperate, obsessive search for Stephen that Cary was severely neglected.
He just became a ghost in his own home.
The neglect was profound,
Yeah.
and the trauma compounded. Shortly after his brother was taken, Cary himself was sexually molested by his own uncle.
It's just wave after wave of trauma.
Then, miraculously, Stephen escapes and comes home. But Cary is a teenager now.
And instead of pure joy, Cary is overwhelmed by immense jealousy, right?
Yes. His parents had emotionally abandoned him for 7 years, and now they were showering Stephen with attention, and the media was treating Stephen like a hero.
So Cary felt he was permanently living in the shadow of his brother's tragedy.
So the defense team takes this horrifying childhood, and they argue that this environment, combined with biological factors, created a severely mentally ill man who couldn't control his actions.
They bring in Dr. Lynn McGinnis. She diagnoses Stayner with psychosis, schizophrenia spectrum disorders, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and trichotillomania.
Trichotillomania is an impulse control disorder where a person compulsively pulls out their own hair.
And Stayner had been doing this obsessively since he was 3 years old, leaving bald patches.
Right. The defense used this to show a lifelong, documented history of an inability to control his impulses.
But they didn't just rely on psychiatric interviews. They brought in hard, physical, medical evidence.
Yes, Dr. Joseph Wu performed PT scans on Stayner's brain.
And those scans showed a distinct decrease in frontal lobe metabolism. Can you explain why that specific detail is so critical to an insanity defense?
Well, it comes down to the mechanics of how the brain regulates behavior. The frontal lobe is essentially the brain's executive control center.
It's the brakes.
Exactly, it's the brakes. It regulates our impulses, our aggression, and our ability to foresee consequences. Metabolism in the brain equates to fuel and activity.
So if a PET scan shows decreased metabolism in the frontal lobe, it means that area of the brain is underactive.
The brakes are failing. Dr. Wu argued that Stayner's brain was physically deformed, possibly from an injury at birth, or the compounding effects of extreme trauma.
Making it biologically impossible for him to inhibit his violent primal urges.
That was their argument.
I'm trying to put myself in the jury box here because on one hand, you have literal brain scans showing physical damage. You have a childhood defined by extreme trauma, sexual abuse, and profound neglect.
Very compelling factors.
But on the other hand, you have a guy who meticulously wiped down a rental car trunk, carved a fake message into a car hood, and planted a wallet in another city to trick the police.
Right.
How do you weigh biological brain damage against such clear step-by-step calculation?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it really comes down to the strict legal definition of insanity in the state of California.
How does the state define it?
The law recognizes that a person can have a severe mental illness, or a history of horrific trauma, or even abnormal brain scans. But none of those things automatically excuse someone from criminal liability. The legal threshold for insanity asks two very specific, very narrow questions.
Which are?
At the time of the crime, did the defendant understand the nature and quality of their act? And did they know that what they were doing was wrong?
And this is where the prosecution brings in their heavyweight, Dr. Park Dietz, a renowned forensic psychiatrist.
Yes.
And Dr. Dietz's argument is essentially that trauma loads the gun, but calculation pulls the trigger. The duct tape, the gloves, the ruse, those prove Stayner was actively aiming.
Exactly. Dr. Dietz didn't deny Stayner's tragic upbringing or his mental health struggles. He bypassed them to focus entirely on the behavior before, during, and after the crimes.
He looks at the choices he made.
Dietz uses Stayner's own intelligence against him. If Stayner didn't know his actions were wrong, why did he use a ruse to gain peaceful entry?
Why did he bring white gardening gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints?
Why did he disconnect the room's phone so the victims couldn't call the front desk for help?
Why did he drive miles out of his way to dump Curl's wallet in Modesto?
Every single one of those actions is a choice explicitly designed to evade capture.
Precisely. And in the eyes of the law, you only go to such extraordinary length to evade capture if you inherently understand that what you just did is wrong and punishable by society.
A person acting purely out of uncontrollable psychosis or a sudden loss of impulse control does not burn a getaway car and plant a false map.
They just don't. The trial itself was grueling. It wasn't just this sterile battle of psychiatric experts. It was a relentless parade of horrors for the family sitting in that courtroom.
It must have been unbearable.
Reading the Supreme Court brief, the details of the autopsy findings, the terror those women must have felt in that motel room, it was so uniquely dark that it broke the professionals.
Yeah, there's a moment during the sentencing hearing that stands out.
The judge, right?
The presiding judge, Santa Clara County Superior Court Judge Thomas C. Hastings, actually began to cry.
Oh.
He abruptly stood up and walked out of the courtroom to compose himself.
You really have to pause and consider the anomaly of that moment. Judges preside over terrible cases every single day.
They are trained to maintain absolute stoicism.
For the sheer weight of this tragedy to break a seasoned judge on the bench speaks to the suffocating darkness of this specific case.
And that weight was carried most heavily by the victims' families.
Yeah, during the victim impact statements, Jen's son, who lost his wife Carol and his 15-year-old daughter Julie, stood just feet away from the man who murdered them.
I can't even imagine that strength.
He looked directly at Sterner and said, "I know he has no trouble killing little girls in the middle of the night. I just wish he'd step up and take his punishment now."
You also had Stainer's own parents in the courtroom, carrying their own unimaginable burden of grief and guilt.
Yeah.
His father, Delbert Stainer, publicly apologized to the victims' families. He made a statement that just haunts the entire narrative of this case, saying if he'd gotten help, there would be 4 people alive today.
Ultimately, the jury sided with Dr. Dietz and the prosecution. They rejected the insanity defense.
They found Cary Stainer sane at the time of the murders, and they recommended the death penalty.
Which brings us to where he is today. Stainer is now in his early 60s. For years, he was housed on San Quentin's notorious death row.
Living in a cell that was roughly 48 square feet.
But in 2019, California Governor Gavin Newsom placed an executive moratorium on capital punishment.
Right.
Because of that moratorium and subsequent state ballot measures, Stainer's execution is halted. He's been moved out of solitary death row confinement and integrated into the general population at Pelican Bay State Prison in Crescent City.
And he is completely ineligible for parole. He will die in prison.
This raises an important question, one that the justice system, psychiatry, and society at large still struggle to answer.
How do we appropriately handle an offender who is undeniably broken by their past, perhaps even biologically compromised by a lack of frontal lobe metabolism, but who is simultaneously, undeniably, a lethal, calculating danger to society?
The legal system provided a verdict, it provided a cage, but it rarely provides absolute emotional resolution for the destruction left behind.
Never.
So what does this all mean? We've looked at the FBI files, we've debated the PT scans, we've unpacked the legal briefs.
But at the end of the day, all that massive legal and psychiatric machinery can't fill the permanent void in the lives of the Sund, Peloso, and Armstrong families.
No, they are left managing an impossible grief. They have built foundations and created memorials to remember Carol, Julie, Sylvina, and Joy.
Choosing to honor them not for the terrifying way they died, but for the vibrant, beautiful way they lived.
To summarize the journey we've taken through your sources today, the serenity of one of America's greatest national parks was shattered by a predator hiding in plain sight.
A man whose pathology was debated in the highest courts, revealing the tragic, multi-generational ripple effects of the Stephen Stainer kidnapping.
It culminated in a highly complex psychiatric trial that forced a jury and forces us to look closely at the anatomy of violence and the limits of the insanity defense.
It's a heavy, heavy case to process.
It is. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought. It's a what if that is incredibly hard to shake once you see the whole picture.
Yeah.
If Cary Stainer's younger brother, Stephen, had never been kidnapped that day in 1972, if the Stainer family's attention, love, and care hadn't been entirely derailed by that singular, consuming tragedy, would the Yosemite murders still have happened?
Was Cary Stainer's pathology an inevitable biological time bomb just waiting for a spark? Or was he the tragic, preventable result of profound childhood neglect?
Keep questioning the world around you, because sometimes when we look closely at that beautiful, majestic wilderness, we realize it's also hiding the darkest shadows of what we leave unchecked.